Hello sleepyheads, it's me. And today we are going to learn some history that might just make you fall asleep. So let's get into it. The first human being to be treated with antibiotics was actually given penicillin to cure syphilis. This is terrible news for you because rats were responsible for spreading a horrible disease called the plague. The first hospitals weren't created until the 17th century, almost 1,000 years after the Black Death ravaged Europe. In 2020, it was valued at over 15 billion. What would you do? Well, hopefully brush it off with some toothpaste. When the Industrial Revolution started in the 1800s, it brought about new inventions like the steam engine and the cotton gin. But one of the most important inventions was air conditioning. And remember to subscribe for more fun historical tales. See you next time. Bye. This changed everything and allowed us to live comfortably in hot climates. But before that, people had to deal with the sweltering heat, and it was unbearable. In 1912, the highest temperature ever recorded in New York was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1936, the highest temperature ever recorded in Chicago was 105 degrees Fahrenheit. In Los Angeles, the highest temperature ever recorded was 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Can you imagine? It is brutal outside during those temperatures. You probably couldn't even find a cold drink of water. If you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't last a day because even the nights were unbearably hot. There was no air conditioning or refrigeration, so food would spoil quickly and people would constantly be fighting off flies and mosquitoes. Even sleeping would be impossible because you'd be too hot. It's hard to believe. But back then, summertime was a nightmare. But if you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't have that option. We use our smartphones every day to do things like call our friends, play games, or browse social media. But did you know that the first iPhone wasn't created until 2007? That means that for hundreds of years, people had to live without them. And if you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't last a day because you had no idea how to entertain yourself. And plus, you'd have no way of knowing what was going on in the world. Back in the Middle Ages, there was no TV, radio, internet, or movies, so people would spend their time reading books or listening to musicians. But if you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't last a day because even books were rare. Most people were illiterate and couldn't read, and the printing press wasn't invented until the 1400s, which is why books were expensive and rare. So if you were alive in medieval times, you'd probably be sitting around all day doing nothing but staring at the walls. And let's be honest, that can drive anyone crazy. You would have to wait until a traveling dentist came to town. These dentists were often traveling barbers who were paid to pull teeth and treat illnesses in the mouth. But they weren't exactly the best at their job. They pulled teeth with pliers instead of Novocaine, and sometimes they even reused instruments. So you'd probably die from an infection. The first toothpaste wasn't created until the early 1800s, and it took another 50 years before it was available to the public. But even then, it wasn't as popular as it is today. People would often just use salted water to clean their teeth. But we now know that flossing and brushing with fluoride toothpaste is key to maintaining good dental health. And without it, you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. We use billions of rolls of toilet paper each year. But did you know that toilet paper hasn't always been around? In fact, you would have had to use something else during medieval times because toilet paper wasn't invented until the mid-1800s. Before that, people either used water, a sponge on a stick, or a piece of cloth. So if you were alive in medieval times, you definitely wouldn't last a day because you would get horribly sick from doing that. In the Middle Ages, sanitation was not a thing at all. Waste would pile up in the streets and people would just walk through it. Plus, they shared drinking water with livestock and didn't wash their hands before eating, so you'd catch something immediately. And if you made it past the first day, you probably wouldn't make it past the second because at this time, indoor plumbing was unheard of. People would just throw their waste out the window. And if you were unfortunate enough to be walking below that window, well, then you just got covered in poop. But hey, at least they had some pretty cool architecture back then. And before that, the only place you could go for medical help would be a local barber or a traveling doctor. That is, if you could afford them. The average life expectancy during medieval times was only 35 years old, although most people didn't make it that long because there were no vaccinations or antibiotics, and every little cut or scrape could kill you. But even if you managed to avoid infection, there were still plenty of other ways to die. You could be put to death by the king, have an untimely demise in a jousting match, or be crushed to death in a building collapse. Since there were no fire codes and buildings were poorly constructed, they often collapsed without warning. On top of this, there were also no police or emergency services. So if you were injured, you were pretty much on your own. And if you couldn't afford treatment, well, you just died. The plague was so bad that it killed 25 million people in Europe alone and was one of the deadliest natural selection events in human history, also known as the Black Death. This horrible illness was caused by a bacterium called pestis and affected every part of the world except Antarctica. Although it originated in Asia, it made its way to Europe via trading ships, where it quickly spread to humans through the rats. Symptoms included fever, weakness, and swollen lymph nodes, which is why it was called the bubonic plague. However, it didn't stop there. The pneumonic plague also existed, which affected the lungs and was extremely deadly. Unfortunately, people had absolutely no idea what was causing this plague or how to treat it, so they just kind of suffered until they died. And the mortality rate was between 60 and 80%. Thankfully, we now have vaccines for diseases like the plague, measles, polio, and COVID. If you were alive in medieval times, you probably wouldn't last a day because a single sneeze could be enough to kill you. Vaccines have completely eradicated many of these diseases and saved millions of lives. However, there are still many parts of the world where people do want to have access to vaccines, and thousands of children die every year from preventable diseases. Syphilis is a horrible sexually transmitted infection that can lead to blindness, paralysis, and death if left untreated. The patient was a man named Charles Nicole, who contracted the disease while working in a Japanese brothel during the Russo-Japanese War. He was then brought back to France, where he received his treatment. And thankfully, he became one of the very few people at the time to survive the disease. But how did he do this? Well, as we mentioned, it was because Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, the first antibiotic ever, by accident. In 1928, Fleming had been growing bacteria on a petri dish when he noticed that there was something strange going on. There was this weird mold growing on the dish that seemed to be killing off all the bacteria around it. He then isolated the mold and found that it produced a chemical that could be used to kill bacteria, and so antibiotics were born. However, they have only really been around since the end of World War II, so if you were alive during medieval times, you wouldn't last a day because any small cut or wound would be a death sentence. Antibiotics now are used to treat all sorts of bacterial infections, from strep throat to pneumonia to urinary tract infections, and they work by killing or slowing down the growth of bacteria, so your body can fight it off easier. But it wasn't until the 1940s that we figured out how to mass produce them. And before that, we had no idea how to treat these kinds of infections. So not only would you probably die if you got sick, but even getting a paper cut could kill you. Now, on the bright side though, you also wouldn't have to worry about getting COVID, you wouldn't be alive. Number 7, no medications. Did you know that the first person to ever receive antibiotics didn't even get it for an infection? New says, new vaccines. The year is 1885 and you just saw a mouse run across the floor. 5, no vaccines or healthcare. Sadly, if you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't last a day simply because there was no healthcare. 4, no toilet paper. In 2019, the global market for toilet paper was valued at $13.7 billion. 3, no toothpaste. Imagine biting into a nice juicy apple and then feeling a sharp pain shoot through your tooth. No. 2, no air conditioning. If you were alive in medieval times, you wouldn't last a day because you couldn't handle the heat. No. Thanks for watching. Do you think you could survive in medieval times? Comment down below.